Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Dan Lanning, the Oregon Ducks, getting the job done on Saturday night. I don't think it felt like a win for Dan Lanning, for the Oregon Duck program, and certainly not the Oregon fans. And I don't necessarily blame Oregon fans for thinking that way. Want to dive into what we saw. Now, this was a really weird game where I had this one up on one of my third TVs, wasn't watching that closely. You guys know I'm a Michigan fan, so it was a little bit more dialed in for the Michigan game on Saturday night. That being said, went back Sunday morning, sat down, drank a cup of coffee, and kind of watched the game from start to finish. It's such a weird one because you look at the box score and go, all right, DG went 41 of 49 for 382 touchdowns. Jordan James almost goes for over 100 yards rushing. Why is this a 10-point game against an FCS team? And then you dive in and just say it was a really choppy game for Oregon. Now, is it time to panic around this Oregon team? I think absolutely not. And I've heard a lot of different people talk about this football game and have a lot of different opinions. And I certainly wouldn't blame Oregon fans for necessarily disagreeing with is it time to panic or not. But I'll tell you kind of why. I want to get into, what we saw from specifically the offensive line, what we saw from Dillon Gabriel. I think there was a lot of nice takeaways for this Oregon defense as well. Now, before we get into it, as always, number one for the Oregon fans, a lot of different Oregon fans feeling a lot of different ways about this football game. Would love to hear from you guys in the comments section, whether you agree with my takes, whether you disagree. That's kind of my favorite part about doing this. And if y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. The Oregon fans, y'all continue to show a ton of love, a ton of support to the boys. I can't thank you guys enough. So again, if you enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. We got the Oregon Boise State preview coming out Monday morning, which I'm really excited to get into. Now let's get into what we saw Saturday afternoon. I want to start with the offensive line, which was significantly disappointing. A lot of the Oregon fans who've been rocking with the boys for the last couple of months, one of the reasons I was such a believer in this Oregon team, projecting them to go 12-0 and win the Big Ten, was because I thought this offensive line was really damn good. I mean, you look at the offensive tackle position, Johnny Cornelius, Josh Connerly Jr., two offensive tackles that I think have every capability in the world to go in the first round of the NFL draft in the next couple months. They clearly did not play up to the standard. That being said, am I ready to panic on the offensive line? No, absolutely not. Because you kind of look at this Oregon offensive line and their performance, I think it had a lot more to do with the lack of continuity on the offensive line than it did with the personnel and the talent level of the offensive line. Like, look, we know what Harper can do. We know what Josh Connerly can do. We know what a Johnny Cornelius can do. We know what Poncho can do. We've seen these guys play really good football on the offensive line. They suddenly didn't just become to stink at football. I think the big problem is you look at, go back to spring practice and fall camp. For the majority of the offseason, Oregon was operating with Poncho at center and Matthew Bedford at guard. With the injury to Matthew Bedford, it's not just one of those, all right, plug and play our backup guard. You're moving Poncho to guard, a position that he does not play a ton of and certainly did not rep a ton of during the offseason. And then you go with a former walk-on. I think he's a former walk-on. If the Oregon fans know, yeah, you go with a former walk-on at center. And so all of a sudden, with the injury to Matthew Bedford, you're really shuffling the deck on the offensive line. And you look at particularly where that Oregon offensive line struggled. It had to do with, the Poncho Johnny Cornelius side. And so I think a lot more had to do with the lack of communication and chemistry with that offensive line than it was the personnel just not being good football players. I don't think they played their best football game. That's not the best version of a Johnny Cornelius we've seen. We certainly know that. That being said, I don't think it's time to panic and say this offensive line isn't good enough to win in the Big Ten. It needs to get better, but we know what these guys can do. We've seen them play very good football. When you get Matthew Bedford back healthy, I think that is going to really help this Oregon offensive line. Now, that being said, you have to continue to develop depth and you have to know what your Oregon offensive line is going to look like if you do have to start shuffling the deck. Because if you do have Matthew Bedford, go down with an injury before Ohio State, you have to be comfortable with your starting five. I kind of used the example before we went into this football game with Michigan. Michigan, middle of the Ohio State game, loses. They're all Big Ten conference guard and Zach Zinner. Michigan was really comfortable in kind of filling in and shuffling the deck and had an offensive line that, could operate. That Oregon offensive line just seemed to lack a lot of communication and continuity and chemistry. And so that needs to get repped over the next couple of weeks if this Oregon team is going to be a national championship contender. I think my second problem with this football game here is you got to let Dillon Gabriel cook. He's 41 of 49, 380 yards, 2 touchdowns. Brilliant stat line on the box score. Average depth of target for Dillon Gabriel in this football game was 4.3 yards down the field. Now, we know that's a Will Stein offense in terms of we're not always going to push the ball down the field. We're going to get the football out quickly to our guys in space and let them excel. Completely okay with it. You go back to Oregon last year, Bo Nix's average depth of target was only 6 yards down the field, right? We've seen this offense work. My biggest issue with it was it worked because Bo Nix in this Oregon offense last year had the capability of pushing the ball down the field if teams wanted to start kind of scrunching down on the line of scrimmage with a guy like Troy Franklin. You go back to that Idaho game, Dillon Gabriel only took two throws, 20 plus yards down the field, completed one of them, and only 8 passes went 10 plus yards down the field. My problem with this Oregon offense is not the scheme of Will Stein, but you have to have it's either Will Stein or Dillon Gabriel. They got to get on the same page in terms of, hey, if Idaho is starting to scrunch down on the line of scrimmage, you have to be willing to take those shots down the field. And Oregon just wasn't really able to connect on any of those or really try any of those against Idaho. That was kind of the biggest problem that I had with that Oregon offense, where again, we're not asking Oregon to consistently push the ball down the field, but you have to have the capability of doing so, or it's simply not going to work. Now, I think the last part that I want to talk about is Evan Stewart. You go out and spend a lot of significant resources to bring in Evan Stewart to this Oregon offense. We kind of talked about Evan Stewart being that guy to replace someone like Troy Franklin working vertically down the field. Evan Stewart, just was kind of a non-factor in this football game. I will continue to bang the table that I think Evan Stewart's the top 10 wide receiver in the country. I know Oregon has a lot of weapons on the offensive side of the football. You got to get Evan Stewart specifically working down the field involved in this passing attack. It's something that he was a non-factor against Idaho. And I don't know if they were just kind of trying to play coy and kind of hide Evan Stewart from the film. You want to see it kind of play out on Saturdays. Tez Johnson is going to be a beast. I think Tez Johnson is going to have statistically an absolute monster year. You see the chemistry building between – there is one positive there on offense. The chemistry between Dillon Gabriel and Tez Johnson, it's going to be one of the more dynamic wide receiver quarterback batteries that we see in all of college football. And that's going to matter when you play big games like against Ohio State. Going to the defensive side of the football, I thought the defensive line was awesome. You look at Derek Carmen or Tatum Tuioti, Mateo Yu, Jordan Birch, looking at my notes here, Caldwell. They look, I mean, again, it's an FCS offense. That's how it should look. But you're kind of seeing some difference makers emerge within this Oregon offense or defensive line, excuse me, which I think is really exciting. I thought the secondary showed a lot of gel. And you got a lot of new faces coming in, right? Brandon Johnson, really good play. Kobe Savage, I think, looked pretty solid. I think overall the defense played pretty dang good football. And so I think you're excited about that. I think the one, there's two big problems I had rewatching that football game is one, the offensive line needs to continue to gel, and you need to be comfortable going with a different variety of offensive lines. It'll be great if Matthew Bedford comes back into the starting lineup, Poncho moves back to center, and you stay healthy for all 16 football games. I think you have to be prepared for that not to be the case. And you have to have guys that are comfortable coming in and playing together as a unit, because that was the bigger problem. Again, I think the offensive line talent is there for Oregon. They did not play like a unit, picking up pressures, going up against some of those stunts you saw Idaho have some success with. That was the bigger problem there. And then Dillon Gabriel, you brought him in to go win a Heisman Trophy and go win a national championship. Got to treat him like that kind of quarterback. I felt like whether it was Dillon Gabriel just being gun shy and not pushing the ball down the field, where, again, on the TV copy that I saw, I think there might have been some opportunities to push the ball down the field that he just didn't take. Or if it's Will Stein talking to Dillon Gabriel and say, hey, we got to be more aggressive, pushing the ball down the field. You have the wide receivers to do it. Most notably, a guy like Evan Stewart. You got to go put that happen. You got to run the football better too. And what made this Oregon offense so good last year is, yes, Bo Nix was elite for Oregon, but they were a top 10 team in the country in terms of yards per carry. When they decided to run the football, they were very successful at it. The efficiency in the run game wasn't good. Oregon was behind the chains a couple times, and then they struggled with picking up some of those blitzes. I think at the end of the day, this is a team that took in 14 transfers, a lot of which are playing significant roles for this Oregon team. I think the reason it feels so disappointing, I guess in my opinion, would be because the standard was so high, and I'll be responsible for that too. Like I look at this team and say the talent level is absolutely through the roof. This is a team that can win a national championship, and maybe that should be the expectation. And then come out week one after all this offseason hype and just not play your best football obviously doesn't feel great. But at the end of the day, it was 10 first downs to 31. It was 217 total yards to 487. I'm not saying it was good enough. It needs to get better. You can't play like that if you want to win a national championship. That being said, with 14 new faces, a lot of which are playing a lot of football, I think it makes sense for this Oregon team to maybe go through some growing pains. I can tell you this much. I listened to Dan Lanning's press conference. I know he's not thrilled with what happened. He didn't even share what he told the team at halftime and after the game. I believe it's going to get fixed. You guys know how I feel about Dan Lanning. I think he's one of the best coaches in the country. I think he's a great leader of men. I think it gets figured out. And I'm not panicking as much as some other national media analysts might for this Oregon team. It was a sloppy, sleepy week one matchup, maybe looking ahead to the Boise State game. I expect Oregon to be significantly better against Boise State. We'll cut it there. Appreciate you guys rocking with the fellas. Again, if y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to y'all